Agree to? I call the honourable member Claire Curry.
Mr Speaker, let me say at the outset that Labor opposes the Telecommunications, TSO, Broadband and Other Matters Amendment Bill, and we will vote against it. Labor is committed to faster broadband. We are committed to delivering a digital transformation for this country. We are not committed to supporting a charade and the formation of a new fibre monopoly which encourages anti-competitive price gouging behaviours and that won't be good for consumers. This bill takes us backwards and creates a new monopoly for broadband which is free of proper regulatory control, and it will put up the cost of broadband to New Zealanders. It was an extraordinary thing to behold that the bill that came out of the Select Committee, which included as its centrepiece a 10-year regulatory holiday for the winning bidder, which we all knew would be Telecom, and this is Stephen Joyce's baby and was the price he was prepared to let the country pay for the new fibre network, handing the price-setting powers to a secret contractual arrangement between the Crown Fibre Holdings and the contractor, with no ability for the regulator to intervene. Thankfully, he's ditched it, but it was at the last minute after he came back to his bill came back to the House, and it was done under force. Consequently, the compromise permission allows the Commerce Commission to regulate pricing on fibre, but if the Commission believes prices should go lower at some point, then Stephen Joyce says it's the government that should wear that risk, not the consumer, and he gets to make the decision on whether to regulate. Why would the Minister ever agree to regulate if it's going to cost the Crown? And what's the nature of the compensation being promised to the contractor rolling out broadband? It effectively insulates the contractor from any risk. Stephen Joyce has confirmed that there hasn't been an analysis done of the risk to the Crown. Labor has indicated publicly, and I repeat it, that it may repeal other sections of this bill that we believe to have an anti-competitive effect on the telecommunications industry to the detriment of consumers. John Key's personal guarantee was to deliver ultra-fast broadband fibre to 75% of New Zealand homes by the end of this decade for $1.5 billion. People thought that sounds good. It was number 2 in John Key's top 10 pledges before the 2008 election. Instead, what they're going to get is Telecom taking its time to deliver the vast bulk of the ultra-fast broadband scheme to New Zealanders. Telecom, which has a long and infamous track record of price gouging and monopolistic behaviour. Telecom, which is not even committed to the need for New Zealand to have a fibre scheme. Telecom, which is committed to its existing copper asset and believes that New Zealanders can receive adequate broadband services over it for at least the next decade and possibly longer. Telecom, which has a string of court convictions for ripping off the public and for charging too much and for not providing accurate information on the services it's offering. Telecom, which this government swore it was not in collusion with, but took us all through an elaborate charade to get to the point where it awarded Telecom the bulk of the contract. Labor believes this bill is deeply flawed and allows anti-competitive behaviour, even though the last-minute amendment allows some influence by the independent regulator. It will disadvantage New Zealand consumers. From the start, this bill has been severely hampered by the rushed and secretive drafting process and a complete disregard for potential compromises. The government used the commercial tendering process as an excuse to avoid proper consultation. It does a number of things. The most significant thing it does is to set out a process for Telecom to separate into 2 companies so it can qualify to take the majority taxpayer-funded stake in rolling out ultra-fast broadband. That contract, as we know, has now been let to Telecom, which we all knew it would be. Many submitters expressed concern about the bill's potential to entrench anti-competitive behaviour by blocking the influence of the independent regulator. Concerns were expressed it would result in the price of broadband fibre to New Zealanders rising rather than falling, and Labor shares those concerns. Mr Speaker, it's important to put on the record that much of our opposition to this bill lies in the way it came before the House, before the Select Committee, and the secrecy and the lack of transparency surrounding that tender process for ultra-fast broadband, and the method in which the supplementary order paper to this bill was put before the Select Committee and the speed with which it was rushed through, as well as the substance. In addition to this, I also want to talk about the perceived conflicts of interest on two fronts within the tender process. The first relates to revelations that Murray Milner, who's a director of Crown Fibre Holdings, acted as a consultant for Chinese telecommunications firm Huawei while simultaneously serving as a director for Crown Fibre Holdings. That represents a potential conflict of interest, and that Crown Fibre Holdings is managing the tendering process to provide coordination, assistance and commercial technical advice to the ultra-fast broadband selected partners and electing the equipment suppliers for passive infrastructure and Layer 2 equipment for the UFB. That's the same contract which Huawei is buying to provide equipment for the rollout of ultra-fast broadband. The second conflict of interest relates to Bruce Parkes, who was currently the Deputy Secretary at the Ministry of Economic Development for the Energy and Communications branch. He was a senior telecom executive to have been involved in what was later found to be anti-competitive practice by a High Court Judge Rodney Hanson in his judgment penalising Telecom for historic breaches to the Commerce Act. Bruce Parkes' responsibility as Deputy Secretary are ICT policy and the ultra-fast broadband plan, which means that he is heavily involved in the development and advice on broadband policy. Mr Speaker, what this comes down to is that this government made a promise before the election to the New Zealand public that it couldn't keep. It promised 75% of homes, businesses, schools and hospitals would be connected by fibre within 10 years for $1.5 billion. It was too big a promise and it couldn't deliver. Stephen Joyce has spent the last 2.5 years working out how to come up with an elaborate way of appearing to deliver a service that many New Zealanders just won't get, certainly not within 10 years and not at the speeds being promised. In September 2009, the government released its final proposal for the UFB initiative. At this stage, the government investment would be directed to an open access, wholesale-only passive fibre network infrastructure. And let's remember why the government wanted it. The government was looking for a step change in broadband services to deliver economic benefits to New Zealand. However, in July 2010, the policy was changed. No longer was the focus on providing passive infrastructure that anyone could use. Instead, the local fibre companies, the LFCs as they're called, would not have to share that passive infrastructure and they would be protected from the regulator until 2020. What this meant was that they would have the power through to 2020 to restrict access to the network and impose value pricing so that consumers would get only what they were willing to pay for. This would result in much of the capacity of the fibre not being used, even though the cost of letting consumers have this capacity would be close to zero. It would allow the local fibre companies to make more money, potentially reducing the capital cost to the government of the rollout. And the price paid instead is that this country will miss out on the full potential of that step change, and which is at odds with the rationale for the intervention in the first place. Telecom seems to have won the majority of the contracts because of a perception that selecting the lines companies would not guarantee fibre coverage or uptake due to competition from Telecom, even though this competition would arguably produce better results for consumers, including better speeds across the board. So what we've ended up with is a piece of legislation before this House which will allow and even promote anti-competitive behaviour, promoting monopolistic behaviour, which will likely result in higher costs to consumers for the new broadband network. That's what this is all about. A good deal for New Zealanders and a step change for the economy, and we're not going to get either through this legislation.
I call the